Will you use the same link?
We are live now, so let me check if it's the same. There's a background noise
Is this,
coming from your end.
so it's the same link.
I want to check now.
It's still the same. It's still the same.
Yeah, it's the same link. Yes. I can't hear you again.
I unmuted myself.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we can have him now and it to just be three of us. Yeah.
Damola Adebayo joined.
Okay, Docs, can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. I
Yes.
think the issue of too many people trying to join the stream at the same time. Uh,
Why
I
don't
think,
you redirect people to YouTube instead of
yes,
Streamlabs?
yes, that was the plan. But somehow the link, we shared the link with some people, and instead of them going to YouTube, they were coming in the Streamlab.
Yeah, so then you don't accept people joining and you just keep.
Yeah, so I've cleaned that up now, and so I've cleaned that
Okay.
up.
Are we live now or?
Yes, we are live now.
Abeokuta
Oh, okay.
stream joined.
All right, so Biodun, perhaps let's take it again. Let's have the citation of Doc
So,
rather.
welcome everyone to the YHC
Ololudeji joined.
virtual program. And here is a citation for Dr. Damilola Adebayo. So Dr. Damola Adebayo is an assistant professor of African history at York University, Toronto, Canada. Is a historian of Anglophone West Africa, particularly Nigeria. His research and teaching interests are at the intersection of three fields, namely social and economic history, science, technology, and society, and the role of international organizations in the Africa past. His current research team investigates the socioeconomic life of Western technologies in African cities since the 1850s. He is currently writing a book on the evolution and socioeconomic impacts of electricity in Nigeria since the 1890s. His research has appeared in referred outlets, including Past and Present and the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. Dr. Adebayo got his BA degree in history at the University of Ibadan. He obtained his MA from the Graduate Institute, Geneva, Switzerland, where he was a Hans Rudolph Scholar. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Cambridge African Scholar. You are welcome, sir, Dr. Damilola Adebayo.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you, sir. Yeah, so I want to
All right.
especially thank you for joining us today to do this. Okay, um, this is the first edition of YHC as a live streaming event. Okay, we apologize for the glitch that happened. We hope a number of people that join us already. We've had about 30 people join us earlier before that glitch. It appears they are coming back. We have about 8 people now. So please, if you are hearing me now, if you are with us now, please kindly help us invite others that we are back online. So I cannot see my DG now. I'll probably have logged him to do a bit of introduction. Okay, but perhaps if he joins us again, I will do that. Okay. So, Doc, we are happy to have you. We are privileged, I would say, also. Okay, so I'll give you the floor now to do your thing. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much for inviting me to engage in this conversation to give this lecture. I honestly did not realize that this is the first virtual one. Otherwise, and I hope that the energy that I would bring to the lecture would serve as a good example to for subsequent events. I am going to share my screen now so that people can see my slides and they can follow me. Because it's a live stream
Follow
event.
path 3
I
joined.
am making it a lecture as much as possible, and I'm hoping that the lecture would last for no longer than about 30 to 40 minutes so that I can sustain the listeners' attention span. And just before I start, I want to confirm that you can hear me. You can still hear
Yes,
me.
we can hear you. We can
Okay,
hear you.
excellent. Once again, good evening to everyone for joining. Thank you so much for uh, coming to listen to my research. And I do hope that at the end of the day, we would have all learned something with regards to the history of the development of Yoruba cities during the colonial period. Um, in February 1898, the second month of the year in 1898, Lagos became the first Nigerian city to have a local electricity station, right? So, therefore, it would be historically accurate to begin this lecture by saying that the history of electricity supply in Nigeria started in Yoruba land. The colonial government introduced electricity mainly to supply light to government residences, streets, and private African homes. The government also hoped that electricity would spur future industrial activities. So the first power station that was installed in Lagos had a mere 30 kilowatts capacity. And while this is absolutely nothing by today's standards, uh, the capacity to continuously generate 30 kilowatt hours was sufficient in the late 1890s to simultaneously power hundreds of 60 watts incandescent bulbs in the homes of the few wealthy Nigerians and the European officers in Lagos Island. And in addition to that, in those days, Lagos was a small town compared to what we now know today. It had a landmass of less than 2 square kilometers and a population that was estimated at 42,000 in 1901. So we're dealing with a much smaller space. Over time, the capacity of the Lagos electricity station rapidly increased between 1898 and 1960 when Nigeria attained independence. And over the years, Lagos has continued to consume the lion's share of all electricity produced in Nigeria. However, although Lagos is in Yoruba land, it is not the focus of today's lecture. As I have indicated in the title, I am primarily interested in the role of native authorities, in the roles that these authorities played in the electrification of Yoruba cities during the colonial period. The electrification of Lagos was a central government, what we would call federal today, was a central government project and therefore does not qualify as a native authority undertaking. And the reason I am interested in native authorities is that they were the local government arm of the colonial government, and they were typically the closest to the people. The British government introduced native authorities across colonial Africa to execute their system of indirect rule. The native authority system was modeled on uh, formalized traditional institutions, right? The formalization of traditional political institutions that were led by monarchs, kings, queens, and their councils. So, in other words, the British basically took over the monarchical systems across Nigeria, the kingships, in particularly in places where they had kings, or even invented new chiefs, particularly in eastern Nigeria where such things did not exist at the time. So they took over the existing monarchical systems and transformed them into a section, a tier of the colonial government. So it is why, for instance, in Ibadan, the Ibadan Native Authority was led by the Baale, who later became Olubadan in the mid 1930s. So it was led by the Baale and his Council of Chiefs with the support of a secretariat comprising Western educated Nigerians. So native authorities ruled other Africans, both in Nigeria and elsewhere, on behalf of the European administrators at the district, provincial, regional, and central levels. Now, since the mid 1970s, beginning with the work of the late Professor Obaru Ikime, Nigerian historians have produced infrequent studies of the structures and activities of these native authorities. Most publications have examined reactionary relations between native authorities, NAs, and the central administration in Lagos. Such reactionary relationships were often mediated by government officials or crises with interpreters, African colonial employees, European and African traders, mercantile elites, and everyday people. Fewer scholars, however, have examined NAs as direct investors in their communities. This is because in most part of Africa, native authorities were regarded as economically deprived, and the colonial states' resources were often concentrated in the capital cities. In addition, native authorities were often associated with rural areas with primary sector economies, especially agriculture, low population density, very few European enterprises. And when you add all of these factors together, they hamper the ability of NAs to generate surplus revenues. In fact, the consensus among economic historians was that native authorities across colonial Africa had weak fiscal capacity in the years before the First World War. Many native authorities could barely fulfill the tax quota levied on them by the central government. And in some other African cases, resistance to taxation resulted in violence. So, for instance, the Hot Tax War in Sierra Leone in 1898, and in the 1920s as well, the Aba Women's War that would come across. Nevertheless, in spite of all of these examples, in southern Nigeria, particularly in Yoruba land, Yoruba cities were an exception to the general trend of weak NHs. Government revenues in the major Yoruba cities of the 1890s and 1910s and the 1920s up to the 1950s were derived from custom receipts dating back to the 1860s, large-scale earnings on large-scale cash crop production dating back to the 1880s, and other forms of indirect taxes on selected products, including spirits, alcohol, salt, and tobacco. In addition, NAs, native authorities in Yoruba land, they had another advantage that predated colonial rule. So, using extensive archaeological findings, oral traditions, and intelligence reports, scholars from the late Professor Akinla Nwomabo to Professor Akinwumi Ogunjoro have clearly demonstrated that Yoruba communities have been designed around densely populated urban spaces as far back as the 15th century. So, for instance, although Ibadan and Abeokuta were both founded as war camps during the early 19th century, they have been urban centers since the very beginning. And in fact, by 1911, the population of Abeokuta was already estimated at over 60,000 people, 60,000 residents. The implication was that Size meant that they were productive economically, and this meant that taxes could be easily raised, among other advantages. Despite the socio-economic advantages of Yoruba urbanity, no research has actually examined how their native authorities allocated their resources to satisfy local priorities, particularly with regards to electrification. Let me move to here. This is why the subject of my lecture today is significant. So in the previous slide, in the second slide, I mentioned that Lagos was the first Yoruba and Nigerian town to have electricity supply. This information would not be surprising to some of you who are watching me right now, considering that this has been covered in some newspaper publications as well, and also considering that Lagos was the capital of the Nigerian colony. But very few people are actually aware that Abeokuta is the second Yoruba city to own a publicly funded electricity station. The Abeokuta power station was opened in late 1913. That electricity project was fully envisioned by the Egba Native Authority. It was then known as the Egba United Government, but I can go. I don't have time to go into the evolution of that system. The electricity project was again fully envisioned by the Egba Native Authority. It was supported by the Public Works Department in Lagos, and it was financed by a combination of the Native Authority's surplus revenues and a £30,000 loan from the central government in Lagos. So the power plants in Abeokuta enabled the Alake's Palace, the homes of the African elites, and the local agencies of European firms, the African rest houses and churches as well, and as well as the home of the colonial officers to have electric lights. The electrification of Abeokuta was motivated by a desire to become a modern colonial town like Lagos. The desire of Abeokuta to become a modern town would not be surprising to historians who are conversant with the history of West African urban centers and their contact with ideas and products from the Atlantic world. So Abeokuta had an early influence of Christian missionaries, the early influence of Western education, the introduction of print media, Saro returnees from Sierra Leone also partly settled there, etc. In fact, Abeokuta was the headquarters of the Yoruba mission of the Church Missionary Society, and the first newspaper in an African language, the Iweroi, was published in Abeokuta. So it's not surprising that Abeokuta was already desiring electricity as a tool of colonial modernity. What is remarkable, given what we know about public investments in colonial Africa and about electrification in particular, and I'll come to that towards the conclusion, what was remarkable about the ENA, Egba Native Authority investment, was that despite their limited resources, the Egba Native Authority took it upon itself to invest in an electricity project during the 1910s. Going by the conventional wisdom in every publication, in all the literature on electrification in Africa, particularly in the early 20th century, Abeokuta should neither have been considered by the Public Works Department for electricity, and in fact, Abeokuta should not have been able to afford it. Abeokuta was a non-settler colony. It wasn't like there was a large population of Europeans living there. There were no mines, no extensive mining activity was going on there. It was not an industrial city by the 1910s. And it wasn't even the central capital for colonial Nigeria. And every case study that we know so far on the history of African electrification affirms the principle that at that time, electricity was only limited to European settlements, major mining cities, and industrial towns, and central colonial capitals. Yet, the story of Abeokuta in Yoruba land, particularly in Nigeria, is not unique. Between the mid-1920s and the early 1940s, native authorities in 3 other southern Nigerian towns, Ibadan, Port Harcourt, and Calabar, attempted to invest in electrification, financed with surplus revenues from their local treasury. They levied additional taxes on themselves, and they also got grants from the government and large loans as well. But I'm using Abeokuta and Ibadan as case studies for reasons that will become apparent in the next few minutes. So, as I've mentioned earlier, the Egba Native Authority power station was opened in 1913. Not much is known about the electricity projects in Abeokuta. We know that the Egba Native Authority in 1911 obtained a loan of £30,000 from Lagos to provide electric lights and other necessary public improvements. We also know that because that loan was large, certain Egba sons and daughters, particularly those who were living in Lagos, described it as extravagance. And we also know that the loan was repaid through an increase on the duty on spirits, an increase in the duty on spirits. As of 1915, that's 2 years after the Egba Native Authority undertaking was already functional. As of 1915, only a few Abeokuta residents had access to electricity. The Egba Native Authority ran a Colonial that was driven by electricity. The Egba United Government also had a rest house, African churches, private residencies of the richer people, and then there were also European consumers, the Miller brothers at Ibarra, the Bank of British West Africa, John Oates, PZ, Patterson and Zaconis and Co., GB Olivant, etc. They were also customers of the Egba United governments and later Egba Native authorities electricity undertaking. There was also street lighting, so that was where most people benefited. The street lighting was financed by the Egba Native Authority as well, and it ran through the main street of Abeokuta. So what I did from the slide that you can see was, based on the records that I found in the archives, I went to Google Maps to track these locations, right? Because according to in the description of where electricity was, and this is also the main street, as you can see in the picture as well, and you can see the lights, the light poles that sort of continue to exist till date. The street light that was introduced in Abeokuta in the early 1910s ran from the Alake's Palace in Ake Square, past the Ake Church, the police headquarters, through Chapel Market, past the government public building, onto Igbenyi Hills and the house and the residence of the colonial officers, and then terminated in Ibarra, where the European merchants resided at the time. And as you can see, so I basically tracked it, and the main street is still the main street. As you can see, it's an 11-minute drive today. So that was where electricity was first introduced for street lighting purposes in Abeokuta in the early 1910s. Demands for electricity was also high among everyday residents of Abeokuta. For instance, in September 1916, it was reported that the NA was unable to meet the applications from everyday people, not the rich people now. And the reason they could not meet their demand was because of shortage of lamps. Remember that during this period, electricity was primarily for street lighting, for home lighting. The electrical appliances that we know today, some of them were so new at the time that they were not even adopted in the Western world yet, like the air conditioner and all of those things. What they basically used electricity for in those days were like lighting and fans and water heating, etc. Not much is known about the Egba Native Authority from around 1916 onwards until 1930, when discussions for a new system of electrification, partly funded by loans from the Public Works Department, commenced. So a 1931 correspondence letter from between government officials suggested that there were over 1,000 people that were still waiting. They had applied in Abeokuta. So even as of 1931, the demand was still high. Demand was still higher than supply. And annual reporting on the Egba Native Authority became available. And I'm going to show you the stats in a moment. But annual reporting on the Egba Native Authority undertaking became available from 1935 onwards. But we need to take a step back as to why there was a need for an improved system. And to take this step back, we go back to 1925, just 6 years earlier than 1931. In 1925, the general manager of the Nigerian Railway wanted the government to provide electricity for all the major railway stations across Nigeria. During this period, electricity was only limited to the major cities in northern and southern Nigeria. So after multiple discussions, the government decided that they were not going to invest in that. It was too expensive. And that rather they would invite native authorities to invest in their own electricity undertaking and then provide some form of co-financing, co-financing facility to NAs that were fully organized. And I'll come to the definition of fully organized. So in other words, for an NA to be described as fully organized, they must have surplus revenues, surplus revenue that was sufficient to handle the initial capital requirements of the power station and annual maintenance costs after remitting taxes. So in other words, their tax obligations did not reduce. But if they're able to raise more internal taxes and their surplus was large enough to finance electricity, then native authorities were welcome to proceed. So under this policy, the government in Lagos would lend a maximum 50% of the estimated cost to native authorities on terms of interest and repayments to be arranged, right? So to ensure that native authorities were technically and financially viable, the government in Lagos agreed to bear all cost of investigation, up to the point where there was a firm budget, a firm estimate of what was going to cost the native authority. And each native authority would thereafter be responsible for the cost of construction, subject to government assistance, of course, by way of loan. And once the construction of an electricity scheme was finished, it would become the sole property of the native authority. The native authority would retain all revenue from sales of electricity. And when maintenance was beyond the capacity, the technical capacity of the native authority would write to the PWD, the Public Works Department in Lagos, and the PWD would send its staff at the expense of the native authority. So they would still build in NA. So essentially, if NAs were fully organized, if they're willing and able, if they had the capacity to invest in electricity, they are welcome to invest in it, and in as much as they are also willing to pay for it. So based on that 1925 policy, 5 native authorities in southern Nigeria, Port Harcourt, as I mentioned earlier, Calabar, Abeokuta, and Ibadan. So 4 of them, rather, not 5. Port Harcourt, Calabar, Abeokuta, and Ibadan applied for loans to set up their power station. But Port Harcourt and Calabar did not qualify. Obviously, they are outside the scope of our study today because they are not universities. But even though they were interested, they were not even qualified because their revenues, as big as they were, as important as those cities were, their revenues were in the deficits. Nevertheless, because of their significance as coastal towns, the central government would later invest in the electrification of Port Harcourt and Calabar at some other time, right? But it was only Ibadan and Abeokuta in southern Nigeria, in the whole of southern Nigeria, it was only Ibadan and Abeokuta that were qualified to build their own power station. And these were 2 universities based on that policy. So Abeokuta applied for a loan to build an improved system of electricity. You know, they had one already in 1913. It was not sufficient to meet the needs of the people. So they wanted to expand the capacity of that system. So they applied for a loan in 1930. And they were willing to shoulder the entire cost. So after an examination of Abeokuta's annual revenue, the government actually approved the Egba Native Authority's requests for a combined water works and electricity scheme, and gave Abeokuta a grant of £30,000 and a loan of £50,000. The loan was free of interest for the first 5 years. provided that the scheme was not already earning revenue before the expiration of that 5 years, of those 5 years. After the first 5 years, an interest of 5% per annum was payable on the loaned amount on the expiration of the grace period. So for all intent and purposes, the central government was merely supporting the NAs if they were willing to shoulder the entire cost plus interest, right? Due to delays, an improved system of electricity was eventually installed at Abeokuta in 1935, in May 1935. Work commenced in 1934 and it was completed. So customers of the Egba Native Authority undertaking increased at an average of 3% per year from 1935 to 1960. But the records are not detailed enough to show us the disaggregated numbers, and this is because colonial records on the Egba Native Authorities did not become available until after 1935. And I will share the stats again after talking about the Ibadan case study. But we know from the records that there were several files at the archives in Ibadan are actually full of petitions and requests by the Egba residents of Abeokuta and other non-Yoruba residents of Abeokuta who were actually writing letters to the Alake or the district officer for connections to the power station. In fact, it wasn't just in Abeokuta. The progressive unions of the township under the Abeokuta province were also writing to the Alake or the district officer to request a connection of their own town. So this was, even though it was expensive, and I've discussed this in a completely different paper elsewhere, even though electricity was expensive and cost a lot more than the average wage of an unskilled worker and all of that, it did not stop people from desiring this new technology, this new colonial technology of colonial modernity. So I'll move to the Ibadan case study now, even though I'll come back to the two of them together later. So apart from Abeokuta, the Ibadan Native Authority was also classified as fully organized, right? And it's not surprising that Ibadan was also financially stable, considering that it was a significant center of population during the pre-colonial and colonial period. So an investigation for electricity undertaken for Ibadan was first carried out in February 1925 at the behest of the Ibadan Native Authority, right? Further investigations were carried out from 1928 to 1930, but the scheme was discontinued due to the financial crisis of the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 30s. So the process of electricity was restarted in 1933 for Ibadan, when the Ibadan Native Authority sought a financial grant also for a combined water work and electricity scheme. In a letter signed by Baale Okunlola and all 28 members of the Baale Council in November 1933, the Ibadan Native Authority argued that it could afford to contribute up to £13,000 without any trouble, that's in quotes, without any trouble, to demonstrate the viability of their local administration. The Baale Council particularly stressed in another April 1934 petition that in spite of the Great Depression, if sister towns, and in that letter, Ibadan was comparing itself with Lagos and Abeokuta, that if towns like Lagos and Abeokuta can make self-sacrificing efforts to improve their own towns, and I'm quoting now, we fail to see the reason why Ibadan should not be prepared to make similar sacrifices for the improvement and advantage of the town. And to buttress their point, the surplus revenue from the Ibadan Native Authorities finance for the 1933-1934 financial year was £54,084. 54,084. That's nearly £54,100 for that particular year alone. That was the surplus revenue. So the electrification process for Ibadan eventually started in 1936 after more and more petitions were written. The Ibadan Native Authority power station was far more expensive than the Abeokuta counterpart, considering the size of the city. The estimated cost for the combined water and electricity scheme for Ibadan was £225,000. And in 1937, the process started, and it was eventually completed cycle around 1940. The Ibadan Native Authority repaid the loan. So the Ibadan Native Authority got a loan of £150,000 from the central government in Lagos. So the estimated budget was 225,000, and then they got a loan of 150k. And at the end of the day, they actually repaid all the loan in full. They were faithful to the terms of the repayment according to the records, because I was able to track all of these issues over time. They were faithful. So, in other words, these were NAs, native authorities that could essentially afford the electricity scheme. I'd love to talk about the consumption of electricity and all of those things, but time would not permit me, and I still want to deal with some other issues. But the quote on the screen should suffice. So, in Professor Mabogunje's memoir, in his biography, he remarked. This was the quote on the screen was a remark of his his first impression about Ibadan. The first day he arrived. He arrived Ibadan at night. He was a 10-year-old boy at this point. I think this was 1941 or 42 or thereabout. And the view of Ibadan was extremely picturesque. The station was lower, the lights, double electric lights, etc., etc. And the image on the right side of the screen was actually that of Ibadan in the late 1940s. So this was in 1941. I'm unsure with the date is not clear, but this image was from this image is from a colonial record, from the image of the colonial the colonial government collection at the the National Archives in London. That's where this image is from. So throughout the colonial period, electricity consumption in Ibadan and Abeokuta continued to grow in leaps and bounds. Native authority investments in electricity were officially terminated in 1950, right? When the colonial government completed nationalization. So it was in 1950 that the Nigerian electricity industry was nationalized, was fully nationalized for the first time. And the story of nationalization is a different story for another day. How all the different municipal, regional stations were eventually brought under the ECN, the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria, by colonial ordinance in 1950. And the process of transferring the Ibadan Native Authority and the Abeokuta Native Authority schemes to the colonial government, to the ECN, is an entirely different story that would also take time to tell. But it shows there's so many corollaries and similarities between that process and what we see today, particularly with the interest of private sector consulting companies, valuation of the undertaking, how much was it worth, who should control it, etc. And I'm happy to talk about that if anyone is interested in the question and answer. But this is where I want to hand the narratives, the case studies, the two case studies, and I want to go to the implication of this story, right? What's the implication of these two stories, these two case studies that I've talked about? What's the significance of the case studies? So to conclude, I would like to reflect on what lessons, the kind of lessons we can learn from the case studies that I've presented in this lecture. So I want to deal with two questions. The first one is what you're seeing here. What are the significances? That should be in plural. What are the significances of native authority undertakings for Nigerian and African history? So, as a historian writing about this topic, what's the point, right? What's the point for historians, right? And then the second question that I want to deal with would be the significances of native authority electricity generation for improving the Nigerian electricity supply industry today, right? So regarding the first question, the slide you're seeing on the screen, my let me just show you the 3 points that I want to make, and I would explain each of the points in details, one after the other. So my research in general has relied on extensive colonial correspondence, colonial letters at the Ibadan archives, at the UK National Archives, also at other archives in Nigeria, including Enugu and Kaduna, and also for later years, the World Bank archive in Washington D.C. also has extensive notes on Nigerian electrification, particularly for the 1950s. So I've used all of these records. And what all of these records convincingly prove was that native authorities, African native authorities, were not merely a source of tax revenue for the central government, but also centers of autonomous spending. Autonomous spending meaning native authorities could actually decide what they wanted to spend their money on. There is always this tendency to view local government systems. Native authorities were essentially a form of local governments, right? There's the tendency to view native authorities as weak, both in historical, local governments as weak, both in historical and in contemporary times. However, my research clearly demonstrates that native authorities under colonial rule did more than raising taxes. And in fact, beyond electricity, I've used electricity as the main case studies. Some of you listeners are most likely familiar with other areas in which native authorities invested, particularly in education as well. I'm sure some of you are familiar with NA schools, DC schools, and all of those things. And it's surprising that I haven't actually read anything to the best of my knowledge, and I'm happy to be. I'll be happy. I will be excited to be corrected because I'm keen to learn about this. But I haven't read anything about like any research on native authority schools. So we don't know much about how native authorities actually spent their money, and that leads to the second point, right? Uh, this study of electricity, what I've just done now for Ibadan and Abeokuta, provide and so what I've done for Ibadan Abeokuta provides an unusual opportunity to observe the motivations. So we learned that the reason for investing in electricity was because they wanted to become a modern town. It wasn't because they wanted to exploit their own people. And I'll come to that anyway. We've learned about the motivations of progression, and we also realized the limitations of native authorities' economic and technological choices. So when historians write about native authority, they often make sweeping generalizations. And as I've mentioned in the introduction, that native authorities were poor, they were weak, they were in rural areas, they weren't really urban centers, etc. And they often assume that native authorities were poor and could not invest in infrastructure. However, and that's the third point, my research clearly shows that native authorities were ambitious in their quests to develop their towns and cities. So native authorities were clearly ambitious in their quest for infrastructural development for the benefit of their own people. In this lecture, we see Yoruba native authorities investing in electricity supply for the benefit of everyday residents of their cities. The Abeokuta and Ibadan evidence serves as a counter narrative to the pervasive idea that electricity consumption was a tool of empire and an exclusive preserve of Europeans in early 20th century Africa. So in other studies of electricity in Nigeria, and erudite scholars like Professor Ayodeji Olukoju of the University of Lagos has done extensive research on this topic, particularly with regards to Lagos. And other scholars have studied Zimbabwe, South Africa, Accra, Ghana, Senegal, etc. And in all of their works, they often assume that Africans were incapable of investing in electricity by themselves because it was too expensive. There was also the assumption that electricity stations were introduced as a tool of colonial exploitation. And they are not wrong, by the way, they're not wrong, because conclusions are oftentimes a function of the particular case studies that you're dealing with. So if you're studying, for instance, how the coal mines, the Uji coal mines in Enugu, how they were electrified, That's clearly a story of colonial exploitation. The government invested in the Udi mines to power mining machinery. The same thing is true for Kimberley in South Africa, where the government invested in large-scale central power stations to boost mining activities, right? But then when you look at other case studies, like the case studies of native authority investments in electricity, using Ibadan as an Abeokuta as example for universities, you see that these assumptions are untenable. It is not always the case that every single case study would align with the general conclusion. And this deviation, this counter narrative, is an important contribution, in my opinion, to the field, to our understanding of Nigerian and African history. And moving on to the second question that I wanted to ask. So, regarding the second question, what are the significances of native authority electricity generation for improving Nigerian electricity supply industry today? I want to make I want to propose two recommendations that are derived directly from this historical narrative that I've just provided. So, number one, I want to propose a more radical decentralization of electricity generation. Thankfully, the new government, the Tinubu government, recently signed a new law that will now allow states, private companies, individuals as well, to generate electricity, to transmit it, and to distribute it to consumers. So now we have that. But I am hoping that this new law would this new act that has now been signed, assented by the government, by the president, this new act would be widely interpreted, would be radically interpreted to allow towns, individual towns and cities, individual municipalities, even neighborhoods within cities, even community development groups within cities to pool resources together to invest in electricity supply. So that's the first thing I'm proposing, that using the story of the native authority undertaking as an example. If they can afford it, why not? So I'm hoping that this will be more widely, because the act already exists that captures this, but then now it's a question of interpretation. And I'm hoping that this will be widely interpreted to allow towns and sub-city groups, so municipalities, neighborhoods, community development groups, estates, individual streets even, to pool resources together once they can afford it. Then the second recommendation that is a direct outcome of this historical research is that I'm also proposing a revision of the funding framework for electricity generation. And I'm proposing this like through multi-level partnerships between the federal, the state, and the local governments. So the crisis of electricity generation in Nigeria today, and the crisis of privatization since the mid-2000s, since the first Electricity Act was signed by President Obasanjo, I think in 2005, all through the 2010s, up to the present, the crisis of privatization has proven that it is futile to actually rely on the private sector alone to meet Nigeria's energy requirements. It would be important for the different tiers of governments, the federal government, the states, and the local tiers to pool resources together. So if local governments are willing to invest, I am proposing that they should be supported, or perhaps through loans or grants or whatever arrangement that will be proposed, that will be agreeable to everyone to invest in electricity. It should not just be a top-down process, right? It is not enough to say, let's privatize the sector. Let's kick away the governments. Government business is expensive. There's corruption in government. There is nepotism. And Professor Lukoju has done a fantastic article on all of this crisis, particularly with regards to Lagos for the period between the 1970s and the early 2000s, published in African Affairs, I think in 2000 or 2001. But it's not enough to point out all of these challenges. The main problem is that we're trying to resolve headache by cutting off the head. I'm trying to translate that into English literally. And so by kicking away the government, we've seen that it's not effective for resolving Nigeria's energy crisis. Rather, what I am proposing is that there should be a revision of the funding framework where electricity is no longer part of the exclusive list. Of course, it's the federal government and states are now allowed, but now allowing some kind of multi-level partnerships, as I've proposed it. And I'm happy to talk more about this if anyone is interested. Multi-level partnerships in which local governments would take from their own budgets for capital expenditure and would convert that budget into energy generation activities, and then would seek the help of the state government or the help of the federal government if they don't have enough money, in as much as they are willing to repay over time. This way, I am of the opinion that when electricity generation is closer to the people know whom to hold responsible if there is any fault or crisis, and the entire country will be able to have diverse experiences that would reflect the priorities of government at the lowest level, at the local government level. And this is where I bring my talk to a close. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks so much, Dr. Damola Adebayo. That's quite interesting and engaging and rich research work there, and it has exposed us to and a lot about native authority. And the recommendation is also very superb. Uh, quite recently, a Dawn Commission had an investment uh, program for some of these issues on electricities and railway, and some of your recommendations are also part of what was raised. And I think the fact that you emphasized on the local governments being also partakers of these investments, just as they were in the 1900s and the likes, then it's another areas at which the governments and everyone should look into. And of course, there are varieties of electricity now, the electricity generation now, solars are there and some other ones. So these local authorities can as well look into those areas and find which best suits their revenue or their pocket. So thanks so much for that inciting uh, lecture. So we'll try and
Um,
welcome questions now
okay,
from.
before the questions, okay, let me just I mean, uh, some of the points that really caught my attention, okay, happen to be the interrelationship between even the native authority, the fact that the Egba native uh, authority took a £30,000 loan from Lagos, right? Okay, and of course the Lagos Central Colonial office at the time and all of that. But the boldness, the drive, the kind of boldness they had then to really took on such magnificent infrastructural project really amazed me, and it really changed my mindset, about how we perceived native authorities at the time. We used to think that they were weak, they were poor, they just couldn't do anything. They were centers of oppression, to pass down what the colonial office wants down to the people. Okay, and it really changed my mindset. And somehow I'm beginning to correlate them with the structure of local government that we have today. How things have changed, how local government have now become the actual picture that we envisioned the native authorities to be at the time. And I love also the fact that electricity has always been a decentralized um, affair, okay? And the fact that people could take responsibility for their own life. I would like to ask a question from our guest lecturer. I'm wondering, is there a correlation? I don't know whether your research actually extended to this or not. You may want to answer it, but if it doesn't, perhaps you want to skip it. Is there a correlation between the areas that had electricity at the time and some human development indices like education, health, and living wages? Okay, I would like to know your thinking or insight about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, cool. Um, there is indeed a correlation between cities that had electricity and other colonial infrastructure. But it would be a different question if we ask what led to what. Was it because these cities had electricity that they also had other colonial infrastructure? Or was it that electricity was just one of the things that boosted the reputation of those cities? And I would say both answers are correct. So your question is correct. You'll be right to say yes, the introduction of electricity led to, for instance, in Lagos, in Abeokuta, in Ibadan, uh, which already had, these three cities already had nightlife before colonial rule. I mean, we had the idea of Ojale, night market, and all of those things were already existing. But the presence of electricity led to an extension of lighthouse, right? When does the night end, right? And the brightness of the lights were also the stuffs of legend. Remember that major cities were the way we view foreign cities today, the way we view London and New York and all of those places today was the same way residents of rural Nigeria viewed major cities like Ibadan, like Lagos, especially, and Abeokuta in the 1910s up until the 1960s. So the presence of infrastructure, colonial infrastructure, of which electricity was one, led to, for instance, an increase in rural urban migration, also led to pressure on other social structures of society, etc., etc. And again, obviously, electricity could wasn't just standing alone. These major cities also became the hubs for other forms of infrastructural investment. So Ibadan then ultimately became the site of the uh, University College in 1948, which eventually was renamed the University of Ibadan, amongst other factors. And but beyond electricity, I also hinted in the course of the lecture that the native authorities also invested in other things. So it wasn't just the case that with electricity, more things came naturally. They also invested in schools. We still have places where there are still signs of NA school or DC school today. And so all of these things eventually, as I mentioned earlier, boosted the reputation of these areas. And cities like Ibadan, Abeokuta, and other major urban centers in Yoruba land have continued to enjoy this credibility, even if more attention has now shifted to Lagos because of its overwhelming influence, economic influence, social influence, entertainment interest in Nigeria today.
All right. Thank you for that question. I would like to, while we wait for others that may have questions, okay, I would like to also engage you on something that you mentioned, that the NAs in Yoruba land were quite an exception to NAs in other places because they could take up, such, they were not just centers of colonial oppression and the likes. Okay. Now, is this because the Yorubas were already living in city centers, or what actually led to, I mean, the fact that the native authorities in Yoruba land could qualify to be given the loan for such project, while native authorities in other places just didn't meet up.
Okay, thanks again for the question. And I will just re-emphasize the part of the lecture where I had already answered that question. And it goes to say that before a native authority can be regarded as technically and economically viable to invest in an electricity station, such a native authority must have surplus revenue after paying taxes to the central government in Lagos. Now, one thing that really helped Yoruba cities, particularly Abeokuta and Ibadan in this case, to be able to apply to apply for permission to build their own power station was their population density, which again is a function of pre-colonial Yoruba urbanity. Now, uh, how did Yoruba towns evolve? That's a question for archaeologists and geographers to answer. But we know from all kinds of records that Yorubas have always lived in large communities even when they have farmsteads elsewhere, right? They have Ilu and they would have Oko in other places. They've always lived in large scale community. The Yoruba system of urbanization is not common. There are other examples. There are similar examples too, particularly in Central Africa and all of those places. But it's not the case throughout Africa. Like I've been muted. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
So it wasn't the case throughout Africa that people lived in large towns. In fact, major towns like Nairobi in Kenya are actually colonial creations. Major towns like, particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa, major even like Johannesburg and all of those places were colonial creations. They weren't existing prior to colonial ruling the way they existed today. But for pre-colonial universities, for pre-colonial Yoruba towns, the idea of living in large communal urban spaces, high population density, is something that goes as far back as the 15th century, and it became an advantage under colonial rule because they were able to pool resources together from their engagements on large scale farming, crafts work, and other occupations within the occupational structure of Yoruba towns. I hope that that answers your question.
Yes, perfectly, perfectly, and I think it kind of reinforces uh, the movement to entrench federalism as what some people call true federalism, as a mode of governance in Nigeria. A kind of a form of a governance that decentralizes a lot of things and allow independent units or autonomous units to be able to take their own destiny in their hands and progress at their own pace, rather than nationalize everything and try to move to unify development across the country. I think the experience or what we've learned from the lecture has shown us that, look, you cannot really dictate development across a country as big and diverse as Nigeria at a uniform pace. It is better to allow autonomous units to actually develop at their own pace. I welcome my Oga at the top, Wale, into the studio. I don't know if he has a few comments to make.
You hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you, Wale.
Okay. Let me start by thanking the guest speaker, Dr. Damilola Adebayo, for a
Please, we
well.
need a little introduction about you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Once again, let me just say a very big thank you to uh, the erudite scholar, Dr. Damilola Adebayo, for a well delivered talk. My name is Olawole Oladeji. I am a student of history. I like history, and I like to learn from scholars and historians like you. I've really benefited from your lecture. And let me say that when I first saw the invite, I took my time to do a bit of background understanding so that I won't just be hearing some things for the first time during the lecture. And I actually came across some very scary data while I was doing my research. Permit me to just share a few of them. I got to understand as at 5 years ago that put together in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, what we were generating was just 28 gigawatt, which was equivalent as at then. I don't know if anything has changed to what Argentina in South America is generating. Now, population-wise, southern sub-Saharan Africa have a population of over 1.3 billion, whilst Argentina that we are talking about only has, a population of maybe 620 million. So you look at the difference and look at oh, sorry, just a population of less than 200 million, I mean to say. So
Yeah.
when you look at what Argentina as a country is generating and compare it to what about 40 countries in sub-Saharan Africa are generating. Then also, I also read some few things about what the World Economic Forum released on energy generation in Nigeria, and not just in Nigeria, but in Africa. And I'm so glad that you talked about it also in your lecture, where you started from, Lagos, Abeokuta, Ibadan. Then you had an overview of Africa as a whole. It's quite amazing that we started very well, at least from when we started in 1896, as you said, up to 1950, when it was centralized and taken away from the NA, the native authority. Now, linking this to economic poverty, it's been confirmed or research has shown that energy poverty contributes a lot to economic poverty, especially amongst women and people living in the rural areas. Like, for instance, the rural urban migration that we see due to uh, not having enough jobs or opportunities in those rural areas. Now, my question to you is this: looking at this, would you suggest that we should allow those in the private sector guys to come in? I also noticed when you are making your presentation that it should not be left in the hand of those in the private sector. But is it not even better to have it in the hand of the private sector and have a close monitoring than to allow it to remain with government? Because government has a lot of things to do. Government has quite a lot of things to do, and we all know that government has no business in the real sense in business. Now, would it not be more advantageous and more beneficial if we allow those in private sector to probably be in charge and probably with the right policies in place from government to monitor it and to ensure that it is not abused or it is well managed? That's just my question.
Um, Thank you very much for your contribution, and thanks for your question as well. I will try to answer the question to the best of my ability, based on how much of what you said I can recall. So, first things first, I am not proposing that the government should take back the electricity sector that have already been privatized. What I said, or maybe I didn't say that, what I meant to say, or what I believe I said, was that it should not be left in the hands of the private sector alone, and that the state, the federal government, the state government, the local government, all forms, all the tiers of governments, they have a role to play. So that's the thing I said, and I made that statement based on what we've observed in the different aborted privatization attempts since the mid 2000s, right? So at present now, uh, the electricity generation, the private sector companies can invest in electricity generation in Nigeria. I'm talking about prior to the signing of the new act by President Tinubu. I'm talking about what was existing already from the mid 2000s. In fact, from the 2010s, private sector companies can already invest in generation, and we also have distribution companies, the discos. However, the transmission subsector or sector, depending on how you view it, has been completely in the hands of the government. So uh, what is currently observable is that you are welcome to invest in 100 megawatts capacity generation plants, but you have to feed it into the national grid that is owned by the federal government. So that's what we currently have at stake. Now, to make a proposal that everything should be completely handed over to the private sector uh, is, I'm looking for the right way to describe it, but because I've actually also written about this, I have an unpublished paper on this, on the question of privatization alone. And it's because, for instance, the first question you ask is, what is the first responsibility of a private sector company? Profit making, right? Now, what is, when you want to invest in anything, especially expensive infrastructure like electricity, a single company cannot do it. Now, what do? You take loans from uh, banks and other financial institutions, private equity, etc. Now, what is the average repayment period, the time horizon to repay a loan? Usually not more than 30 years. However, most new investments in electricity supply, if you want to do it well, you are not going to be making profit for the first 30 years. So you're going to be running at a loss during the time horizon that private equities, private firms, banks would expect to make their own money back. If you want to make profit during those 30-year period, then you're going to price electricity, the tariff, the rate will be so high that only very few people will be able to afford electricity. So you see, it's a double-edged sword. If you are asking the private sector to take over the management of electricity in Nigeria today, particularly in a country where the energy requirement is so severe that we require over 60,000, by some estimates, by some newspaper estimates, over 60,000 megawatts of new generation. Now, if you compare with other African case studies, the Grand Inga Dam, or is it Great Inga or Grand Inga in the Congo, that is meant to generate electricity is going to cost over 100, no, the last time I checked, 80 billion US dollars. Now, if you take a loan of 80 billion US dollars and you want to repay back, so you see, at the end of the day, when you take individual country cases into consideration, you would understand why certain policies would fail if you adopt them wholeheartedly. Now, the point you made that government has no business in business, from my own school of thought, is untenable. And I say this because the examples that you are pointing at, if you think about the US as the archetype of capitalism, these examples did not get to where they are today overnight, right? And in fact, for electricity, in all system of government, whether it's communism, socialist, capitalist, if you check the history of electrification across the world, a global history of electricity, the government has always been involved. Even in the US, there's a federal water scheme and all of those things, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, it is only after what is available is sufficient that you can, and the regulatory environment is conducive enough that you can then say, okay, let's hand over things to the private sector, let them continue to manage it so that we can take off the burden from the government. But in as much as what is required would cost a lot of money beyond the duration of time that private equity companies will be willing to loan you money to invest, because they will not be able to recoup their investment, particularly if you're thinking of 100% electrification for the entire country, then the government has a role to play. And this thing is not even a super serious issue. The energy requirements in Nigeria is so much that there's enough room in the sky for the private bird or the public bird to fly. Again, I'm translating Yoruba to English right now, but I'm sure you understand what I mean. And that's where I would stop.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Adebayo, for that very stimulating conversation. I think I've thoroughly enjoyed myself here today, and I think I'm speaking the mind of everyone who has joined us also today. You spoke about some of the areas that deserve um, uh, further
Study.
lectures on their own or further studies on their own, and this kind of excites me that we can take this conversation further. But I like the fact that um, that culture, our culture, our experiences can actually dictate our developmental pace, and I think that is exactly the point we're trying to establish here at the Yoruba Historical Conversation. It's not just a conversation, but rather we're trying to understand what has been in the past and how we could leverage on them to create the kind of future that our forefathers actually envisaged. So I don't know if there's any other further comment before we bring this conversation to a close today.
Yeah, I think from the chat we have Matthew Ayodele asking that as I read, I wonder if the economic productivity or revenue generation strengths of early 20th century universities shape which city gets access to electrification.
I thanks Matthew for the question. I guess it was one of the first things that I said in the first few minutes of the lecture. It was, if you cannot afford it, if you cannot afford electricity, then you don't get it. So, for instance, I mentioned that there were four cities in southern Nigeria that actually wanted to benefit from that 1925 policy of government. Port Harcourt, Calabar, Ibadan, and Abeokuta for southern Nigeria, and for northern Nigeria it was only Kano really that was qualified. And Kano also had their own NA undertaking, I think in 1930 or 1931. But that's also a story for another day. And a colleague of mine up north, Dr. Jinedu Danladi, has written a brilliant dissertation on that topic. For cities to be considered viable for electrification, as I mentioned earlier, there are two requirements. You have to have surplus revenue after, that's the second part, after paying your taxes to the central government. And so, as important as Port Harcourt and Calabar were to the colonial government, they didn't even meet this requirement. But obviously, because of their significance as major port cities, major commercial centers, the government eventually invested in the electrification of these areas as direct central government undertakings. But for NA undertakings, you must be financially viable. The technical aspect was not important because the PWD was willing to supply the technical assistance at the expense of the NA. So the NA must be able to pay for it. If PWD engineers will be sent to repair the power station, it will be at the cost to the NA. So if ultimately it was a function of economic capacity, it was, in fact, that's the primary, and in fact that's the only requirement really. If you don't have enough surplus to carry investments in electricity supply, including the construction of a power station, then you don't get a co-financing facility. You don't access the co-financing facility from the central government, and you don't get a grant.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that. It's a pity I couldn't get my DJ on in the studio to have a word. We will master this technology and grow with it. So I want to thank you, especially Dr. Adebayo. Your coming online, your passion and your commitment to this encourages us that we can actually take this to the next level. So we thank you for coming on, and we thank you also, and we hope that when next we call, we will find you in good health, in good spirit, more prosperous, and also available to answer our call. Okay, thank you, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you